Hey there, my name is Rob and I work on product at Voiceflow. We're a tool that helps conversation design teams design, prototype, and build multimodal conversation experiences for Alexa, Google Assistant, and custom voice assistants. It's great, it's a fun job, and as part of our work to build a great product, we do a ton of customer research. That means we spend a lot of time talking to conversation designers, copywriters, developers, UX designers, PMs, and marketers about their workflow. Based on this, feels like we've got to have some unique insight about the best practices, tools, and processes that are used by conversation design teams around the world. The big caveat here is that no two teams are the same. Team size, life stage of their product, whether they're new or experienced, and the composition of the team all changes what works best for them. And so I'll get the disappointment out of the way early here, that after all these conversations, I can report there really isn't a magical one-size-fits-all process that works for every conversation design team. The thing about the conversation design process is it gets applied to many projects over a designer's career. Projects come in many shapes and sizes, from big to small, each which require their own combination of team members, tools, and methodology to be successful. Projects generally fall into the following categories: unknown problems with unknown solutions. These are rare opportunities in most conversation design teams out there. The ability to build out a new conversational experience from scratch, whether it's building a custom assistant or designing an in-car experience or building and launching something completely new for Google Assistant. These opportunities are rare because they're big bets that a company is making that conversational experiences will be a core part of their ongoing customer experience, and that having a great conversational experience will allow them to grow their audience or their business or their revenue. For the conversation design teams tasked with these projects, they're largely filled with unknowns. That can mean they require a ton of upfront research, prototyping, and experimentation before you get into the actual building of things. The next category is known problems with unknown solutions. If you're working on an existing skill or assistant, then the major improvements that the design teams are focused on is adding new functionality and features. These are typically building on an existing, well-defined base. You have conversational components you can reuse, the brand persona is defined, you can reuse responses that have already been approved by the legal team. Introducing new functionality for an existing customer experience would be an example of this, or extending existing functionality to apply to a new customer segment, or even porting over a skill to a completely new channel. All of this revolves around your existing product, so you largely know the why and how the problem is happening, so the majority of your team's time is invested on designing the right solution. The last category is the known problems with known solutions. And the unsexy reality of being a conversation design team is that this is where you get to spend 60% of your time working in a year. These are small iterations and improvements made to an existing skill or to the functions of your voice assistant. Stuff like revising responses for a particular user flow, editing your intents to capture a new edge case, or just dealing with not so happy paths in the existing experience. These are small tasks for a conversation designer that are mostly executional work, but you still go through your design process all the same. Despite this, each conversation design team we speak to spends their days working on such wildly different projects, their process still ends up following a fairly familiar pattern. This diagram is not unique to conversation design. If you've ever attended a UX design conference, then there's a 90% chance you've seen this before. Thankfully, it's a great articulation of the conversation design workflow as well for most of the teams we speak with. On the left, you've got research. This is the first phase of a project where you're really trying to gain a shared understanding amongst your team of the user, their pain points, their context of use, the business objectives you're trying to meet, the resources you have available, and the competitive landscape that your solutions will live in. You need to get aligned on the problem before you can really build a good solution. As you work through your solution design process, you're trying to build a representative version of your solution that you can have your users and stakeholders interact with. A prototype is a vehicle for feedback, both qualitative and quantitative, allowing you to gain new insight, understand technical and resource constraints, and gather new ideas that will ultimately let you iterate on your solution design and make it objectively better. And finally, in design, you get to go heads down and actually build out the end-to-end solution. This is where you invest the time to build every flow, write every response, localize every one of those responses, and map out integrations and make your conversation ultimately ready for production. Depending on your project scope, you'll jump into the conversation design workflow at different places. If you're building out a voice assistant or an app from the ground up, that's likely an unknown problem with an unknown solution, so you'd be spending a lot of time upfront in the research stage. Or at least you would in an ideal world, assuming you have one of those miracle projects with both the timelines and budget that allow for it. If you're simply adding a new error handling case to an existing skill, that's likely a known problem with a known solution, so you're going to jump right into design. The most experienced teams that we speak to have a process that is adaptable to all types of projects, from big to small, and they get there by focusing on building out a playbook of conversation design tools for each phase in this life cycle. Project to project, you have little certainty how it will unfold, what the right tools and processes and resources to use for it are. Trying to map out exactly what your process will look like before you've even started is at best a waste of time, and at worst, it'll lead you down the path to designing the wrong solution because you're inflexible, and unable to change course as new information, data, and user feedback comes to inform your work. The idea of product teams needing a playbook was introduced to me by John Lax in a Medium post he wrote a few years back. I believe we need to create playbooks for building products. We need to have a set of plays we can go to so we can build better products, smarter and faster. Building a playbook of how you build products is essential for every company, but missing for most. A playbook is ultimately a collection of methods and tools that a team can use throughout the lifecycle of their projects. By defining your plays and codifying them in your playbook, the goal is to ensure that each team member knows exactly what their role is, when it's used, what resources are required, how it works, how long it should take, and what the expected outcome is. Creating standardization with these plays helps to manage the expectations for your team and for your stakeholders to use as you use them. And this concept applies to conversation design teams exactly as it would any other team. But because our field is so nascent, there aren't a lot of teams with well-defined playbooks. These playbooks get built by trying out new tools on different projects and learning what works based on the scope of a project, the internal resources you have available, the customer segments you're building for, and the industry you're working on. A tool that works in one scenario won't necessarily work in another. All of these are contexts that will make some plays more useful than others from project to project. You can also pick up new tools by seeing what works for others in the conversation design community and applying it to your own work. And that's how I fortunately get to spend a good chunk of my time working at Voiceflow, talking to users, conversation designers, and teams working in the space, and trying to learn from them what their process looks like and what plays work best for them. It would be selfish to keep all this wonderful information to myself, so here's some of the most commonly used plays that we've seen from conversation design teams across the country. Up front in the research phase, the goal here, again, is really just to get internal alignment around who you're building for, the problems that you intend to solve, and a high-level concept for what that solution looks like. Some of the plays that we see most commonly used here are conversation design canvases, persona design, key use cases, customer journey maps, research interviews, voice design sprints, sample dialogues, and storyboarding. In the first stage of most conversation design projects, the primary goal is to get that alignment on what that high-level solution concept is. If you're designing VAs or conversational experiences professionally, that likely means you have teammates and stakeholders that need to be aligned and brought in on the project in order to get any work done. And that's maybe where you spend the majority of your job. Step one is understanding the pain points that exist for your potential users. All potential solutions you design need to be informed by this understanding of your customers, their jobs to be done, the existing solutions in their lives, conversational or otherwise. If you're building a product from scratch, none of this work will be done. So that will be the starting point. Working through some design canvases, running customer interviews, mapping out your persona, working through some design sprints. If you're iterating on an existing VA or skill, then this context should be defined for you already. So you can either, you can really leverage the existing work that's done and update that as you go through it and discover new information working through your project. The next step towards that team alignment is really to explore those high-level solution concepts. At this stage, you want to focus on getting a breadth of ideas on the table. To do that, it's best to communicate your ideas in the lowest possible fidelity. That's where sample dialogues, storyboards, and basic user flows are great. There are two reasons you want to communicate your ideas at a really low fidelity here. The first is you get structural feedback, not granular. So stakeholders will be focused on very high-level articulations of the conversation solution you're creating, and they will give feedback around core flows and functionality. If instead you present them with complete detailed designs, then they're more likely to focus on specific dialogue choices or edge cases you have, and that feedback's not really helpful at this stage in time. It's too soon for this type of granular feedback, and it's not really helping you get buy-in on the core functional idea of that solution. Secondly, at this stage, you want your ideas to be disposable. Spending less time designing a solution idea at this stage means you're less invested in trying to get them to work. It's much easier to throw away an idea if you spent 20 minutes mocking up sample dialogues for than an idea you've spent 2 weeks mapping out the full user flow and writing all the response dialogues for. As an outcome from the research phase, you want to have an agreed upon happy path design for the solution that you're moving forward with. This solution should be a representation of the core experience users will go through to get to whatever value your VA or skill is providing. It's a communication tool for stakeholders, and it's also the foundation on which your fully fleshed out solution design can be built. It doesn't need to be exhaustive, it doesn't need to be definitive, and there doesn't need to be any actual development implementation included in it. In the next phase, you're really trying to validate the end-to-end user experience for your solution design, and also get an understanding of what outstanding requirements are there to get it production ready. The plays we see used a lot in this phase are full-on user flows, interactive prototyping, role-playing, WAS testing, UX testing, running beta releases, and test logging and path analysis. With the problem well-defined, a conversation design team can turn their attention to building a great solution. At this stage, you should have a rough, very high-level idea of how to solve it. It's going to take a few iterations of rapid prototyping, user testing, and internal reviews to get your design to a place where it's ready for development. The first step is to build the solution design based on a set of solution requirements that have come from your research, business requirements, and technical requirements up front. The tool of choice here varies from spreadsheets and flowcharts to design and prototyping tools like Voiceflow, but the end output serves the same purpose: an interactive conversation experience to test with your users. Regardless of what form your design assets are in, you should be in a position to test your prototype with the users in some capacity, whether that's through WAS testing or running full-on user UX research sessions, or even putting something out as a beta release. A prototype should be a medium fidelity version of your solution that should be representative of the end user experience, but doesn't need to match that one for one in terms of functionality. If your end voice skill requires that user go through an auth flow, for example, your prototype should put the user through an auth flow, but they can use a generalized username and password. They don't need to use their own. It doesn't need to call the database. The biggest challenge for your conversation design teams is actually doing this testing with users in context. Conversations especially are much more dependent on the context of use. The three biggest contexts to think about when you are planning your prototype testing is, the first one is environment. So if you're building an in-car voice assistant, you need to be testing your conversations in a car. If it's an Alexa skill, then your user's likely using it in their kitchen or their bathroom. Unfortunately, your user's environment is never usually sitting in front of their computer, so that makes this one harder to accomplish. The second context to think about is situation. An in-car assistant is likely to be used in traffic when the user is distracted, maybe a bit flustered. As much as possible, tests should try to put the user in situation, or at least role play that situation. You don't need to run them through these tests in the middle of rush hour traffic, but at least try to get them in that frame of mind before starting the test. Finally, interface. As conversation becomes more and more of a multimodal design experience, then we need to make sure that our designs are representative of the complete end-to-end user experience. That means we should be aiming to build integrated prototypes that live on device. Being able to meet all of these criteria of the user's context is unrealistic, but we should at least strive to get as close as possible. Building a voice assistant or a skill is a big investment, and as conversation design teams, prototyping is the biggest thing we can do to de-risk that investment. And finally, design, where we're creating all of the required artifacts and documentation that are going to inform the development of our conversational experience. Here's where we're running plays like AI model training, response scripts, defining integration requirements, doing long tail mapping, error handling, dialogue management, and creating voice style guides in our conversation design systems. Taking your conversation experience from a prototype to a live product is really where the bulk of the grunt work happens on any given project. Your prototype should be an 80% accurate representation of your end user experience, and it's here in the design phase that you really need to define out that remaining 20%. Step one in this work is all about content creation, writing the responses, training your NLP and NLU, documenting technical integrations, building edge case flows, defining error handling for all the things that you can't catch. The conversations design teams we speak with use a variety of tools to accomplish these tasks, but ultimately it's the tools that reduce the time required for handoff between design and development that win out. Because these requirements, documentation, and conversation assets get used over and over project to project, teams are now looking at ways to standardize it for easy reuse. So we're starting to see more teams build out their conversation design systems and voice style guides to act as a source of truth for these conversational assets. What it allows them to do is mix and match existing user flows, responses, visual assets, logic paths, and functions to cut down on the time spent prototyping and developing in the future. To get to the point where you have a fully fleshed out playbook like that for your team can seem like a lot of work, but if you're working as a conversational design team or as a conversation designer right now, you can already get started because all of this comes from the experience of doing the work. The best place to get started is by looking back on all the conversation design projects from new huge builds to quick bug fixes and mapping them against this conversation lifecycle. Knowing what general processes different types of projects go through will help you organize your plays around where and when they can add most value. The next step is to document your plays. What types of tools and methods did you use on each project? What was the context for that project? What resources? What timelines? What customer segments? What type of stakeholder involvement? How useful was it in that scenario? Your playbook isn't useful, though, if you're the only one who knows about it. So make sure to onboard your team and your stakeholders so their expectations are set for where, when, and how they will be evolved along the way. And finally, beg, borrow, and steal from other conversation design teams because you can learn a whole lot from their experiences. And hopefully I can give everyone watching today a bit of a head start in building out your own team's conversation design playbook. I've compiled links for all of the plays that I have talked about in this presentation at this URL. And a big thank you to everyone who's watching today. It's been a real honor to be a part of this conference. So all the best and enjoy the rest of your day.